Hey, all, it's David Ducker coming back at you. And today, can we do a kind of a ramble? It's not one of those topics where I have a definite uh, point. So I'm inviting the ramble here. Um, Basically, I'm talking about high fantasy versus low fantasy. And I'm trying to talk about what the difference is. Because you can talk to, 10 people and they'll each have a different idea of what the differences are between high fantasy and low fantasy. So I just thought I'd go out with my opinions, and they may or may not coincide with some of your opinions, and you can share your opinions in the comments below. Hopefully we can learn something. We'll see. So for me, the differences between high fantasy and low fantasy, there are a couple. I would generally place it, first of all, down to institutions. How large are the institutions of your world? Low fantasy tends towards very small institutions, city-states, and coalitions of city-states, whereas high fantasy tends towards sprawling empires, vast kingdoms. So that will determine the kind of stories you can tell. Conan goes wandering from city-state to city-state, doing adventures in each one of them. Whereas Lord of the Rings involves, and these might be the two archetypical examples. Conan is low fantasy, and Lord of the Rings is high fantasy. So Lord of the Rings has these big kingdoms, and you have to forge alliances between them, and if you're outlawed in Gondor, you gotta ride for a while to get out of Gondor. Whereas if Conan is outlawed from some small city-state, from Zamora, for example, then he just walks outside the walls and he's good. So the consequences of pissing off the ruler are minimal. The resources the ruler can bring to bear are minimal in low fantasy. Whereas high fantasy is the opposite. The rulers are really powerful, their organizations are complex and hard to escape, and it's just a bigger scale. Instead of an army of like 1,000 men versus another 1,000 men, that's a big battle for low fantasy. Instead of that, you've got a million-man army, the vast hordes of the Persian Empire. Or you've got the 10,000 orcs of Saruman, or however many orcs he had. But the scale gets way bigger. So if you think one wonderful property that brings the two together, I would say, is Game of Thrones. Because in Game of Thrones, some areas are high fantasy. Like if you look at the adventures in King's Landing, and they're talking about all the different kingdoms of the seven kingdoms. All the seven kingdoms of Westeros fighting each other and moving their armies around, jostling for position and political power. That to me is very high fantasy. Big issues. Whereas if you look at Daenerys Targaryen and her story in Essos, she's moving from small city-state to small city-state, having low fantasy adventures in each one. And each individual person is important. The big institutions aren't really present, and they're not really important when they are present. So Game of Thrones has the best of both worlds. You get the big time over in Westeros, and you get the small time in Essos. And George Martin did them both very well, because he is awesome. But you can really see both flavors. I was just reading Dance with Dragons. I remember the first time I read it, and I was going through it, and I'm like, oh man, Essos is the stuff. Essos is so cool. You got all these city-states, the sword and sandal vibe. I want to play some Conan. I want to read some Conan. And then if you're, I remember reading through parts of the earlier novels, and I was thinking, oh, this is awesome, high fantasy. I want to go reread The Hobbit. And I'm like, yes, The Hobbit and the Battle of Five Armies. That was a huge clash. It was epic in scale. And now in theaters, in fact. I think they made a movie about it. but I think they made a movie. But when I reread it, I was like, this is awful. This is so bad. Compared to Game of Thrones, the Battle of Five Armies gets like 10 pages, and it's not very epic. It's not very awesome. And maybe that's why George Martin avoids writing battle scenes, but it was really bad, in my opinion. So that's one difference between high fantasy and low fantasy. The other, and this is the one more people will harp about, and so this is the one I didn't want to harp about, because you have lots of people talk about magic. And this is what I'm talking about. The magic is what most people will focus on. So I wanted to focus on the government. Be like, well, the government really does make a difference too. High fantasy has big government. Low fantasy has small government. That's a big difference between high and low fantasy. The other difference, and the one most people will jump on right away, is magic. So there's two things to worry about with magic. There's the power of magic, and then there's the frequency with which it appears. So really high fantasy will have really powerful magic, flying sky islands held up by the power of a wizard, and they'll have like people calling down meteors and undead armies, just raise a whole undead army up and open a vast portal to hell and have demons pour out. Really powerful magic. You know, a 100-foot tall golem made out of solid gold. You know, the golden man. You know, really high magic, ridiculousness. And they'll have a lot of prevalence. It'll be everywhere. So you'll have a sky fleet of wizards on flying carpets. So you'll have 1,000 flying carpets. And they'll all have a magical staff that blasts lightning. There'll be 1,000 of those. And, you know, maybe everyone has a magical familiar. They're just born with it. Like the Golden Compass style. Everyone has a magical familiar. And everyone can do basic spells. Like you know, clean things with magic. Prestidigitate. And the streets are lit by magical candles, and the cobblestones are magically clean, and the city has a magical dome. Every city has a magical dome around it. So even for low fantasy, you know, low magic things, they're everywhere though. So that's like really high fantasy, and then really low fantasy will have like no magic or a very small prevalence, and or that magic will be very weak and or non-existent. So that you've got this kind of spectrum. So you can have a lot of magic, but it's weak. You know, so nobody has really powerful magic, but mages aren't that hard to find. I really like that style a lot, because wizards can only be about as strong as a warrior, so they're kind of balanced. You know, balanced if you care about that, but they're prevalent. So there's a lot of them. So you could play a wizard, and it wouldn't be that unusual. I really like that style. I would say Warhammer Fantasy is in that vein, depending on how many magic users you're going to depict. But I depict it as that. Lots of magic, but it's very weak. And then the other way, and the other way would be there's not very much magic, but if there is, it's crazy powerful. It's ridiculously powerful. But there might only be like one or two guys. But these one or two guys, let me tell you something, Baba. So this would be like Aladdin. There's no magic except for this genie, which is crazy powerful. And Jafar. Although Jafar is not a great example because he started off weak. But like, let's say Jafar, after he's got the genie power, after he was leveled up by the genie, his magic skill. And if you're playing Pathfinder, that also leveled up everything else about him because they cannot be separated. But we're not here to crack jokes on Pathfinder. Well, maybe a little. But that's not our primary point and purpose. If I could stutter for a moment. But, so, and this can be fine too. Especially, you might see this in Conan. There's only one wizard, Thulsa Doom. But he's really, really powerful. He's crazy powerful. So that could still be low fantasy. So you can be low fantasy if you have prevalent magic, as long as it's weak. I'd still count that as low fantasy. And you could have really powerful magic, but as long as it's not prevalent, you could still be low fantasy. So it's all good. You can tell that I prefer low fantasy, by the way. This video is flagrantly biased. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which I probably should discuss in this video, but I won't. So I'll do it in another video, but not this one. So, and then, for your high fantasy, a lot of magic, very powerful magic. So you want to look at like Pathfinder, Eberron. That's about all I can think of. That's that crazy level of power, and it's everywhere. It's just everywhere. So these settings are really, really hard to design so that they make sense, and so that, just so that they make sense. That's it. All you need out of a fantasy world is for it to make sense. It doesn't matter if it is nothing like the real world, as long as it makes sense and it's consistent. And the more powerful and the more prevalent your magic is, like, that gets exponentially harder. One thing I like about Golarion, the Pathfinder setting, is it was clearly not written with their rule set in mind. It was not written with 20th level wizards in mind. And and if you think about 20th level and how powerful that is, even a 10th level wizard is stupid powerful. That's only half as powerful as the 20th level guy. So, the magic level of Pathfinder is ridiculously huge. And they made no accounting for this when they made their setting. They made a really, really good low fantasy, low magic setting. And magic might be prevalent, but in the descriptions of magic, it's not very powerful. So the setting is awesome, actually. The rule set is like the opposite. The rule set is like there's lots and lots of magic, and it's really, really powerful. So I've never seen... And what you probably would get is something like Eberron, if you really tried to make that sensical. And I hate Eberron. I unabashedly hate it. I could cut Eberron to ribbons for an hour. There are so many problems with it. But that's not my point today. My point is merely that it's really hard to do high magic, high fantasy well. Even if you look at Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Rings had very low prevalence of magic. There was like 4 wizards in the whole thing, at most. If you count Sauron and Radagast and Gandalf and Saruman. Maybe there was another one, Galadriel. Okay, there's 5. There's like 5 wizards in the whole thing. And, but they never really demonstrated huge amounts of power. So, I've seen people argue that Lord of the Rings is low fantasy because of that. That's why I really wanted to harp about the governments and how that changes the feel. Because if you're playing a peasant or a wandering swordsman, low fantasy is the way to go. Once you're in high fantasy, if you're playing a wandering swordsman, you don't matter at all. And I like my characters to matter. So if I'm doing high fantasy, like Game of Thrones, like I would say Lord of the Rings is, you've got to bump it up so that you're at least a knight. So you have some government political power, or a priest who's in maybe a bishop or something. So you got to boost up the political power for high fantasy because the government's more complex. But that's this is a ramble. This is my opinion. It's not like these terms are in the dictionary. So I'd love to hear about what are your thoughts? What do you think high fantasy is? What do you think low fantasy is? where do you draw the line? What's the matrix that you use? You know, I broke that magic matrix down into 2 parts. So if you got like a 8-part matrix, please share that with us. It'll be too complex for me. Other people will love it. I guarantee that. RuneSlinger will love it. But I'm going to stop my ramble here. Let me know what your thoughts are. And if you disagree with me, let me know that. If you love Eberron, if you're the one man who loves Eberron, you can go ahead and share that too. You know, I will laugh. Much like that. But I do hope they have a good day, even if you like Eberron. I won't hold it against you. You know, God bless you for loving something that everyone else hates. I'm going to sign off now, though. Take care of yourselves.